Mossdale Caverns flash flood tragedy. On June 24th, 1967, 10 experienced cavers entered one of the most dangerous cave systems in Britain. The cave was called Mossdale Caverns. It sat beneath the lonely moors of the Yorkshire Dales in northern England. The cave stretched for nearly 7 miles underground. Most of the passages were so low that cavers had to crawl on their bellies through freezing water to get through. A return trip to the far end of Mossdale took between 8 and 10 hours. Fewer people had seen the far reaches of this cave than had walked on the moon. The 10 cavers were members of the Happy Wanderers and the Bradford Pothole Club. Experienced underground explorers, June had been a dry month and the weather that Saturday morning was beautiful. The group entered the cave around lunchtime, full of confidence. 3 hours later, 4 members of the group decided not to continue and turned back toward the entrance. The remaining 6 pushed deeper into the cave. They reached the far end safely and even set off a small explosive charge to try to open a new passage. Nobody knows what happened to them after that. While the 6 cavers were deep inside the mountain, the weather above ground changed without warning. A violent thunderstorm struck the moors. Rain hammered down on the already saturated ground and poured straight into the cave entrance. One of the 4 who had left early, a woman named Morag Forbes, went back to check the cave entrance at 9 p.m. What she found made her blood run cold. The entire entrance was underwater. Mossdale Beck, the stream that normally trickled into the cave, had turned into a raging torrent. The cave was completely flooded. Morag ran 2.5 miles across the dark moorland to the nearest farm and had the farmer call the police. Within hours, every caver in the region had been called to Mossdale. But there was nothing they could do. The water was too high to enter the cave. Rescuers dug a trench to divert the stream away from the entrance and built a dam to hold back the water. By dawn, the scene on the moor looked like a battlefield. Fire engines, tractors, mechanical diggers, and over 300 rescuers. It was the largest cave rescue ever launched in Britain. When the water finally dropped enough to enter, rescue teams crawled into the cave. It took 5 hours to reach the far passages. They found 5 bodies in the far marathon crawls. The 6th body, a young man named John Ogden, was found the next day in a small rift nearby. All 6 had drowned when the rising water filled the low passages they needed to crawl through to escape. The coroner decided the cave was too dangerous to remove the bodies. The entrance was sealed with concrete. 4 years later, friends of the dead cavers entered the cave one last time and buried their bodies in a chamber called the Sanctuary. A memorial cairn sits on the moors above, directly over the place where the bodies were found. Mossdale Caverns remain the deadliest cave incident in British history. The cave proved that a dry summer morning can become a death trap by nightfall if the rain decides to fall. Hidden River Cave, flash flood escape? On May 26, 2016, a group of college students from Clemson University in South Carolina entered a cave in south-central Kentucky on a geology field trip. The cave was called Hidden River Cave. It was a well-known show cave in the small town of Horse Cave, with guided tours and even an underground museum. The students went in around 10 in the morning with 4 tour guides. They planned to spend about 5 hours exploring the cave as part of their studies. It was a normal, supervised educational trip. But while they were underground, the weather above them turned violent. A flash flood hit the area much earlier than expected. Torrential rain hammered the Kentucky hills and poured straight down into the cave system. The water rose fast. Hidden River Cave had only one entrance, and that entrance was flooding. The students had no idea what was happening above ground. They had no radios and no way to contact the surface. When the guides realized the water was rising, they led the group to a higher section of the cave called the attic. The attic had a higher ceiling and was safer from the flooding below. The group huddled together in the dark, waiting. On the surface, David Foster, the executive director of the American Cave Museum, saw the flood coming. He grabbed a small team and went into the cave to find the students before the water sealed the entrance. They found the group about a mile inside, safe and dry in the attic. But the way out was filling with water by the minute. 2 local police officers also entered the cave to help, and they too became trapped by the rising flood. Now there were 19 people underground: students, guides, rescuers, and police officers. Over 150 emergency workers gathered at the cave entrance, but nobody could get in. Hours passed with no communication from below. Nobody on the surface knew exactly where the group was or if they were still alive. Inside the cave, the water kept rising. The group made a decision. They could not wait any longer. They would try to walk out through the flood. The 19 people formed a line and waded toward the entrance through pitch-black tunnels filled with rushing water. By the time they reached the entrance passage, the water was up to their necks. They grabbed onto a rope and pulled themselves through the swift current, one by one. At 4:30 in the afternoon, more than 6 hours after they had entered, all 19 people walked out of Hidden River Cave alive. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted, but not a single person was injured. The students were checked for hypothermia but refused further medical attention. Hidden River Cave proved that even a tourist cave with guided tours can become a death trap when the rain falls fast enough. Veryovkina Cave Flood Pulse Escape. In September 2018, a team of elite Russian cavers and 2 British photographers descended into the deepest known cave on Earth. The cave was called Veryovkina. It plunged 2,212 meters below the surface of the mountains in Abkhazia, a remote territory in the Caucasus region. The expedition leader was Pavel Demidov, one of the best cavers in Russia. The British photographer was Robbie Schoen, hired by National Geographic to take the first ever photos of the cave's deepest point. It took the team 4 days to reach the bottom. Descending thousands of feet of ropes, crawling through mud-choked tunnels, and squeezing through cracks that barely fit a human body. Their deepest camp was a flat, sandy spot nearly 7,000 feet below the surface. They spent 7 days at the bottom exploring, collecting samples, and photographing the terminal lake, a turquoise pool surrounded by jet-black limestone. Then, on the morning of September 16th, everything changed. A radio call crackled through from 2 cavers higher up in the system. A flood pulse was coming. They had 30 minutes. At first, the team was not worried. Flood pulses happen often in deep caves. Then the sound hit them. It was like a freight train crashing through the mountain. The roar got louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Everyone rushed out of the tent and stared up into the darkness above them. Then a massive wall of white and brown water exploded from the shaft above and cascaded past their camp into the abyss below. The ground shook beneath their feet. Robbie Schoen turned to his assistant, Jeff Wade, and said, "We need to leave right now." There was no time to pack. Robbie abandoned tens of thousands of dollars of photography equipment on the cave floor. He grabbed only 2 memory cards from his camera, the only photos ever taken of the deepest point on Earth, and shoved them into a waterproof bag inside his suit. The team sealed their latex suits, strapped on harnesses, and began climbing for their lives. They crawled along a narrow ledge above rising water, then scaled a 20-meter cliff face with waterfalls hammering down on them from above. When they reached a camp at 1,900 meters deep, they could go no further. Above them, a waterfall had completely flooded the passage to the next level. Below them, the water was still rising. They were trapped between the flood and the falls, nearly 6,000 feet underground. For 16 hours, the team waited. The Russian cavers kept their spirits up, laughing and joking in the tent. Robbie and Jeff could not relax. They kept their harnesses on and paced outside, watching the water level. When the first of the other cavers appeared from the darkness below, Robbie asked if anyone else was behind him. The man said no. In that moment, Robbie and Jeff believed the rest of the team was dead. But one by one, the others appeared. Bruised, soaked, exhausted, but alive. The flood pulse lasted 20 straight hours. Every single member of the expedition survived. Expedition leader Pavel Demidov died 2 years later in a cave near Veryovkina. Robbie Schoen said the experience was so intense that it inspired him to start a family. Veryovkina proved that even the deepest cave on Earth can fill with water in minutes, and that the only way out is up. Alpazat Cave, British Soldiers Flood Rescue. On March 17, 2004, 6 British soldiers and their civilian guide entered a cave system in the mountains of central Mexico. The cave was called Cueva Alpazat. It was over 8 miles long and dropped nearly 300 feet into the earth beneath the Sierra Norte Mountains in the state of Puebla. The soldiers were from the Royal Navy, the British Army, and the Royal Air Force. They were part of an official military caving expedition called the Combined Services Quetzalcoatl Tiger. The trip was planned as a 36-hour training exercise inside the cave. 7 other members of the expedition stayed on the surface as support. 6 underground soldiers pushed deep into the cave, navigating narrow tunnels and flooded sections with expert equipment. Then around noon, the sky above the mountains opened up. Heavy, unforecast rain began hammering the jungle slopes. Several inches of rain fell in a short time. The water poured straight down into the cave system and flooded the low-lying passages near the entrance. Within hours, over 100 meters of tunnel between the soldiers and the exit was completely underwater. There was no way out. The soldiers had trained for this kind of emergency. They retreated deeper into the cave to a pre-prepared emergency camp in a section that had never flooded before. They had sleeping bags, a first aid kit, food, water purification tablets, and a two-way radio. They radioed the surface team. They were alive, unharmed, and had enough supplies for up to 2 weeks. Morale was high, though they admitted they were slightly bored, but getting them out was not going to be easy. The flooded section was too long and too dangerous for the soldiers to swim through without diving equipment. The British Ministry of Defense took charge of the rescue and flew in two of the best cave divers in the world, Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson from the British Cave Rescue Organization. These were the same two divers who would later help save the Thai boys trapped in Tom Luang Cave in 2018. Mexican soldiers and local rescue teams also arrived at the cave entrance to assist. But the rescue caused a diplomatic problem. The British soldiers had not told Mexican authorities they were entering the cave. The Mexican government was furious. Local officials said the lack of advance notice made the rescue much harder than it needed to be. Rumors spread that the British soldiers were secretly surveying the cave for uranium deposits, though the British government denied this. After 8 days underground, Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson dived through the flooded tunnels and reached the trapped soldiers. They brought diving equipment and guided each soldier one by one through the submerged passage to the exit. All 6 soldiers emerged from the cave on March 25, 2004, healthy and calm after more than a week underground.